Hello, this is Rick Jordan, the Church Resources Coordinator for the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship of North Carolina. Welcome to today's webinar on understanding and ministering to blended families. Our presenter today is Chrissy Binion. Chrissy is the Minister to Youth and Children at Pleasant Hill Baptist Church in Grover, North Carolina. She is also a licensed professional counselor associate at CareNet Counseling in Marion through Wake Forest Baptist Medical Center. Chrissy graduated from the Dual Master's Program at Gardner-Webb University in 2018 with an MA EDS in Mental Health Counseling and a Master of Divinity degree. Today's webinar will begin with Chrissy's presentation. If you have questions or comments to ask, you may enter them in the question box at any time. That is at the bottom of your screen. It's a green box with Q&A. The questions will be presented at the end of her presentation, so feel free to ask a question at any time. Thank you for your participation in today's webinar, and a reminder that this webinar is being recorded and will be stored on the CBF of North Carolina Virtual Resource Library on our website. Chrissy, welcome.
Thank you, Rick. I am nervous but excited to be doing this. I am looking forward to it, the next hour that we have together.
Yeah, me too. And I know you and I were chatting just a little bit before this that there are not that many resources, so I really appreciate your being a resource for us on blended families today. And before you begin your presentation, could you tell us how you became interested in this subject?
Yes, and I actually covered this a little bit in my presentation as well. But when you approached me about this, I was thinking, you know what, I know all about blended families, and because I work with them in counseling mainly. Our church is very small, and we have, well, within the church we have quite a few blended families, but the children and youth that I work directly with, there are very few. So as I got to thinking, I was like, well, actually, do I know much about ministering to these blended families? So it was a very, very good topic for me to research and figure some things out about, and now share with everyone watching.
Great, great. Well, thank you for the work you've done already to help us learn more about this. And so I'll hide myself and we'll get into the presentation. You can share your presentation with us.
I'll pull it on up. Okay. There we go, we good? So today we're going to be talking about how to understand and minister specifically to blended families. I will start telling you a little bit about myself. I know you see my face on the screen, but here is my headshot. This is kind of how I start my therapy sessions, actually. I tell a little bit about myself, so you're not telling your story to a complete stranger. I know you guys aren't necessarily telling your story to me, but just want to tell you a little bit about myself. So as Rick mentioned, I graduated from 18. I did their dual degree, which I got a Master of Arts and a Master of Divinity at the same time. With the Master of Arts, I got it in mental health counseling. Attached to that was also an education specialist degree, which is kind of a step between master's and doctorate level. Basically, I just taught and taught and taught and taught all through grad school. I taught my peers, I taught lots of different classes. I got lots of opportunities to teach. So that's kind of what that EDS degree is for. My MDiv, I got through the Gardner-Webb School of Divinity. I did both of those programs at the same time, which sounds pretty fancy, but really it was just 4 years of a lot of hard work. I worked very, very hard, and I'm very proud of my degrees that I got to get. And so it may be obvious, but I'll go ahead and say it. But therapy and ministry are my two passions. I don't think I could ever choose between either of them. They mean so, so much to me. Growing up, I never actually went to therapy, and I found it kind of, what's the word, serendipitously. And it just kind of found me. And that tells me that God was in that, and God showed it to me that this is what he wants me to do. Ministry I've been a part of since I was very young. I remember always going to church, always wanting to go to church, being involved in pretty much anything I could be involved in. I actually grew up United Methodist, so I haven't been Cooperative Baptist for most of my life. It's only been within the past probably about 4 or 5 years that I've been involved in the CBF world. And so to be able to do this webinar is an honor that you guys will let me even do this. So I've been in youth and children's ministry since March of 2017. And I serve at Pleasant Hill Baptist Church. That's in a very small town in Grover, North Carolina. Rick and I were just talking about how it's not really even a town. There's not a stoplight or anything, but it's just outside of Shelby. So I live in Shelby, and I do my ministry over in Grover, but it's pretty much all one and the same. It is a very small country church, and it houses the most wonderful people I've ever met in my life. They're so supportive, and they care about me so much, and they really care about their ministry to their community and to each other as the hands and feet of Christ in this world. I am always eternally thankful for my church family at Pleasant Hill. And then last, I became an LPCA last July. So an LPCA is a licensed professional counselor associate. I'm working towards full licensure toward my LPC, which is a licensed professional counselor. The only difference is LPCAs are under supervision. LPCs are not under supervision. They can pretty much counsel and do as they will. But I have to answer to higher powers still at this point. So this is a little bit about me. I am very excited to be able to do this webinar. Very nervous, as I said earlier, but I am grateful to have this opportunity. So why blended families? Rick asked me a little bit about my interest in the topic, and as I got to working on this and I got to research and I was figuring out what I wanted to say, I realized most of my interactions with blended families came from my work in therapy, really. So in therapy, I can't even tell you, there's been tons and tons and tons of instances where I work with clients who are a part of a blended family, have step parents, have step other relatives. The list goes on and on. Each family is very different. But I also realized the privilege that I had growing up with two parents who were very happily married and still are to this day. Actually, this May they celebrated 36 years together, which is really, really awesome. Something that I feel like we don't see a whole lot anymore, really. And so I not having to grow up in a blended family because as I researched, I realized just how difficult changing your family system can be, and usually not even having a choice in changing it. It's just something that kind of happens to you as you're a child and as you're a teenager. And so I just want to mention that I'm very thankful for having the childhood that I had and having the parents that I have. But that doesn't mean that I can't learn about new experiences and other people's real life situations. I'm always very open to learning and to figuring out what makes life different for other people. Big reason as to why I became a therapist. as you can imagine. I listen to lots and lots of stories every single day, and it is an honor to get to even listen to those stories that people trust me with. One story that also helped me figure out my privilege of having two parents who are happily married. So this quote that's on the screen right now came from a friend who is a teacher. So she is my friend Kelsey. She was my roommate in college. She and I have grown up together. We've known each other since middle school, the rough days, the cringy days. And so we've seen each other change a whole lot. We roomed together at Appalachian when we were in college. And now she is a 10th grade English teacher over in Mooresville, North Carolina. She is awesome at what she does. And one day over the summer, we were talking, and I think we were getting lunch or something, and we started talking about how much children and teenagers have on their plates all the time, how different life is for them than it was for us. I mean, I graduated high school in 2010. It doesn't sound that long ago, but things have changed drastically, not only in technology, but socially, and with the pressures that students face and problems with getting into college and such. So Kelsey was telling me about this activity that she has her students to do. At the beginning of every year, she wants everyone to see where each other is on the playing field of life, if you will. So she has everyone kind of talk about where they came from and what their life has been like so far. Everything in the classroom stays confidential, but she gave me permission to share this. So she was telling me that one student offered to lead the discussion one year, I think this past year. And her student, this is a 10th grade teenage girl who said something so profound. And she said, "I grew up in a home with two parents who were happily married. What was it like to grow up in a home without that?" And she asked it very, very genuinely. And Kelsey said that this activity just opened her heart. And she said really that she went home and cried like a baby because it was that meaningful for her to see her students attempt to even just try to understand each other, try to understand where each other was coming from. There were students whose parents actively did drugs. There were students whose parents were never even together. There were students who didn't even know one of their parents. There were students who lived with their grandparents. There were students who were pressured to be in gangs. But then there are also students who have had happy childhoods. There are students who struggled in school and had learning disabilities. There are students who had other disabilities. There were just students who really wanted to learn about each other. And so this question was so poignant that if a 10th grade teenage girl could ask this and still learn, still want to learn about her peers, how much more meaningful is it for me, someone who's 15 years older than them, who's in the field of helping to heal relationships and helping to minister to people who have been in broken relationships. So that question just really got to me. And so I kept that at the forefront of my mind for most of this webinar research that I was doing. What was it like to grow up in a home without those two happy parents that were happily married? So far, I've talked about it a little bit. My experience with blended family, the clinical side of my life. So I work in mental health. I've been doing counseling, counting internships and everything like that. I've been in counseling since 2016. So I've seen a lot, a lot of people, and I've heard lots and lots and lots of stories of different family types. I work regularly with people who have childhood trauma, and usually with that childhood trauma, you have some sort of brokenness in the home, you have some sort of abuse, you have families that aren't cohesive and whole. There's a lot of different situations. And I can honestly say that each family is completely different. I've never met a client who has the same story as someone else, ever. And that sounds kind of obvious, but sometimes I think when we think about the generics of what families should look like, we think about our own. And we think about what we grew up with, we think about our friends, we think about the small world that has been exposed to us, rather than thinking in the bigger picture. Excuse me. And so each family is completely different. I want to tell this story real quick. This isn't through counseling, this is just some of my friends. So a good example of two families being very, very different. So I have two friends from college, and they grew up 2 streets away from each other. So they were childhood best friends. They grew up, they eventually went to college together and lived in the same dorm room. And they joked all the time about how different their families were. So one friend, she lived on the street further back, we'll say that. She said that her family is very calm. They talk very quietly to each other. They're just very polite, and just, they're nice and controlled. But then the other friend, the one who lives further up the street, she says that their family yells throughout the house, and they slam cabinet doors, and they're just very loud and rambunctious, and they joke and they laugh together, and they're just very loud. But these two friends are best friends, but they come from very, very different family experiences. And so I just want you to keep in mind as I talk, that each family essentially has its own culture. No family is ever going to be the same. Just like how American culture is very different from British culture. Southern culture is very different than Northern culture in the United States. Canadian culture is different from African culture. You don't know what the culture is going to be like until you experience it for yourself. Culture, I found, has been very difficult to explain, but we'll talk about that a little bit more later too. So as I was researching, I was trying to figure out a really good analogy to help explain what blended families are like. Beautiful blended families, as I like to say, because not all families have everything together, but if there is love involved and there is kindness and caring, I say that's a beautiful thing. So I came up with one metaphor on my own, but I found another one while I was researching, and I just loved them both. So I'm going to go ahead and explain what they are. So our first metaphor is a quick skillet meal versus a crock pot meal. Nuclear families are kind of like this, and this is a metaphor from the Gottman Institute. They are a marriage and family relationship kind of, they're like the gurus in the counseling world. If you go to a marriage therapist, very likely they've had some kind of Gottman training. Just a little preface. So you have these quick skillet meals, which are your nuclear families. So there is lots of intensity, there's lots of love, there's just, two people who love each other so much and they want to start a family together. That's your quick skillet. Everything cooks together really fast. It takes not super long. You've already gotten the ingredients prepared and cut up and everything, and it just cooks real quick and then you're ready to eat. It doesn't take long for the flavors to blend together. I don't know if you've ever cooked like garlic in a saucepan on top of the stove, but it does not take long for that aroma to fill the rest of the house, right? So they're just very quick. They're pretty neat, pretty straightforward. Step families, blended families, as you will. I use that language interchangeably. Step families are more like crock pots. If you've ever used a crock pot, then you know that it takes a while. And usually what you put in the crock pot, you want to have lots of really, really good flavor. Something that can't really be achieved through a quick skillet meal. So these step families, they take a little bit longer to get to be a cohesive meal. They take a little bit longer to warm up to each other. They take longer to be able to cook all the way through and provide the nutrients that your body needs. So there's quite a stark difference between these nuclear families and these step families. Another way to look at it is, this is my example, is looking at puzzles. So if you have two puzzles, one is a box of 100 pieces and another one is a box of 1,000 pieces, which one's probably going to be easier to do? Probably that 100-piece puzzle, right? So it can still be overwhelming, don't get me wrong. It's definitely not without its problems, but for the most part, it's pretty manageable. You can find the corners, you can get the outline set, you can build as you go, and the pieces are bigger and easier to see. It's a little bit easier to know what you're doing. But I don't know if you've ever put together a 1,000-piece puzzle. Very different, very, very different. It takes much, much longer to put it all together, to sometimes even find those corner pieces that I like to start with. I feel like most people do. It takes a really long time to get all the pieces situated and where they need to go. Sometimes I'm not a puzzle person, but sometimes I feel like it can take days or weeks. If you're not very committed, it might take years. But step families are kind of like that. They definitely have more pieces involved. They have more relationship dynamics involved. They have more people involved. So with step families, usually you have two families of biological parents and then children of both. Sometimes they're children of other spouses. Step families can become quite large if there are enough people involved. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some statistics for blended families. And this comes from 2009. It was a little bit difficult to find information that was more current. And I looked that up. Trust me, I tried. And kind of find out the way that the Census Bureau does censuses now, if a child lives with a single parent, but also has a step family. So if parents get divorced and child lives with one single parent, but this other parent gets married, if the child is living with that single parent, they aren't counted as living in a step family, even though they most likely have contact and connection with this other family. So the statistics are actually pretty low looking for the rate of step families in America. And like I said, this is from 2009, so I don't expect that it has changed too much because the divorce rate has hovered around 50% for quite a while now. So going through some of these, we're going to look at that second main bullet. I accidentally put these out of order. So the 69.8% who live with two parents. This is children under 18 years of age. So two parents, whether that's a step parent and a biological parent, both biological parents, two parents, that's the household. So 69.8% of children under 18 and under live with two parents. Of that 69.8, 62.5%, going up to the top, sorry, they live with their biological mother and father, which that's pretty good. I feel like that's a pretty high percentage. Granted, again, remember that these statistics for step families are a little bit low. So the 59.7% of the 62.5% are married couples, whether that's, so that is biological mother and father who are married, and then the cohabitate, who have not gotten married but do have children together. We won't stay long on the statistics. I know they can get boring. But then beyond the 62.5, there's still 7.4% of the 69.8% who live in other situations. So 4.5%, which is the largest percentage, they live with their biological mother and stepfather. And most likely this is just due to children staying with the main caregiver, traditional, who usually is the mother. Mom remarries and there's a stepfather there. Next is 1.2% live with their biological father and stepmother. So children who choose to stay with their dad and their dad remarries, that is the 1.2%. 0.2% live with a biological mother and adoptive father. So during custody and all of that, when the father, the non-biological father, the stepfather, adopts the child, and they become one holistic family, even though they are a step family. Legally, they are seen as one cohesive family. Then 0.1% live with the biological father and adoptive mother, same kind of situation. And then 1.1% live with two adoptive parents, which is still a blended family. I don't touch a whole lot on adoptive children, but they are important to recognize that non-biological parents still have problems. Families with one biological parent and one step parent, they have problems too. Families with two biological parents, all families are going to have problems, just very different problems depending on the type of relationship going on. And we'll get into that a little bit later too. And the last two things, then 0.3% live with like some other combination of parenting parents. And then last, American children under 18 years of age living in a two-parent household, 12.3% are part of a step family. And like I said, that number is probably a little bit lower than what it should be, just because of how the Census Bureau does their census. These are some major challenges for step families. So this is from Patricia Papernow, who is the director of Institute for Step Family Education. I thought these were excellent, and she is very straightforward in them. So you have some insider-outsider problems. So this can be between the step parent as the outsider. So the biological parent and the biological children already have this very strong bond. You know, they are biologically related, they're legally related, they have probably grown up in the same house together, which kind of pushes the step parent out a little bit. So that's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking is if the biological parent and the step parent now have this very strong bond, usually a remarriage of some kind. So honeymoon phase, all that good stuff. Now the kids kind of feel like, oh, the step parent has taken our place in our biological parent's life. So there is some sort of insider-outsider problem that comes with most step families. Number two, children struggle with losses, their loyalty binds, and those things change. A little explanation. So when a divorce happens, children grieve that, adults grieve that. Anyone involved in that marriage, in that relationship, when it's coming apart, there is grief there. Children, especially smaller children, may not fully understand why mom and dad aren't together anymore, why dad doesn't live in our house anymore, why mom is suddenly interested in a new person. Children might not always understand that, and so they struggle with these losses, this loss of familiarity, this loss of consistency in their life. It can be very, very painful for them. And I don't, side note, I don't do therapy with children. That is it just breaks my heart, and I would cry all day long. But many of my colleagues who do therapy with children, they say that this is a huge part of their job, is helping children understand loss, especially through divorce and through a cohesive family. Loyalty bonds. This is a really important thing. A lot of time in therapy, especially with custody cases, child is required to get therapy. Parents will often play the loyalty game. So if one parent is trying to gain custody of the child and the other one is also, they may try to have the child in the middle of this loyalty pool. And this is very, very difficult for children. Please, if you don't take anything else away, please know that these loyalty struggles are extremely difficult for children to deal with. They feel like they can't talk bad about one of them. They feel like they can't talk good about one parent. They feel like they have to be all about one parent when they're with them, but really they miss the other parent too. They feel like that there's a very strong imbalance, and really there is. And it's very unfair for children to have to go through that. So like I said, if you take anything away from this webinar, please take that. Loyalty bonds are extremely hard for children. Third, there is parenting issues and discipline. I read in one place that sometimes step parents coming into a new family system, they're supposed to take on the role of a camp buddy or a camp counselor, where they build rapport with the child or children. They don't really discipline, but they're there as authority. They're seen as someone who is there to help and there to be loving to them, but don't necessarily discipline right off. But you also can find that some family systems, like I said, everyone has its own culture. Some new step families, both parents, step parent and biological parent, might go straight into discipline together. Really the biggest thing is these step families usually struggle with that because it's hard to establish those norms, those new norms. Establishing new norms is very difficult. Number 4, building new family culture while navigating previously established family cultures. So this is part of the grieving process. You're leaving something that is familiar, something that you've known for a while, and you have to create something completely new with a new person or new people in your life that you don't quite know as well as your nuclear family. And a lot of time, just having that major change for children and adolescents, it's going to be very difficult. Statistically, adolescents, teenagers have a harder time coping with this and actually transitioning into this new family system because they have spent more time, most likely, with their nuclear family before, and that's what they're used to. They're kind of set in their ways. So statistically, children can be a little bit more resilient in figuring out those new pathways in new step families. Number 5, this is another one that you see in therapy a lot, dealing with ex-spouses and other parents outside the household. I really took this as, mom and dad get divorced. Dad might have a new girlfriend, mom might have a new boyfriend, whatever genders they are attracted to. And so children now, suddenly there are new people in their lives. They don't quite know what to do with that. I remember one family that I saw, mom and dad were in a custody battle, and there were rules and rules and rules and rules in their separation agreement about whether boyfriends or girlfriends can spend the night, how soon they can meet the children after they start dating, what the protocol would be for when they do meet. Like they had really thought it through because they wanted to protect their children. And it might be seen as kind of that loyalty pool again, but if done well, this can be something that's very positive for children. So if a relationship, maybe dad has a new girlfriend, if this new relationship doesn't last and they had set rules to figure out, hey, this is when we introduce this new relationship to the children. If that relationship doesn't last and the child never met that person, it's probably a lot healthier than if there is this constant coming and going of new outsider people. And so finally, the most important thing in these 5 major challenges that step family is just the situation. If you make major changes in any situation, there's going to be problems. There's going to be people who like things the old way. There's going to be problems with loyalty. There's going to be different problems. And it's not necessarily the family, not really the family culture. It's just going to be that situation. And I want you to remember that as we talk more about going into ministry settings with this. So this is my fun practical piece. When this quote, when step family couples are confused or frustrated because it feels like the family dynamics aren't squaring up, it's because they're not. So I'll explain. So if you think of a step family as having 3 sides, you have your biological parent, you have your step parent, and you have your biological children. Each side of this triangle has a different amount of bonds. Starting with the bonds between biological parent and biological children, there are 3 main bonds that we're going to see. Those are a legal bond. Legally, biological parent has to take care of biological children. There's an emotional bond. They usually have children have grown up with the biological parent. And very obviously, there's a biological bond. There is DNA shared between these 2 sides of the triangle. Biological parent and step parent have 2 bonds, so they don't have the 3rd. They only have 2, which is a legal bond, if they're married, of course, and an emotional bond. So they have chosen to raise a family together, spend time together, be involved deeply in each other's lives. And then last, between step parent and biological children, you only have one main bond, and that's an emotional bond. And that emotional bond only starts when the step parent enters the biological children's life. Sometimes this bond can take very, very long to warm up to. Think about that crock pot. You can't just throw it in there and an hour later your food is cooked and done. It takes a while to build that bond, especially as a parent that the children weren't raised with. And so thinking of this triangle, if you can see it, there we go. Thinking of this triangle, when it feels like things aren't squaring up, first of all, we're not looking at a square, we're looking at a triangle. But it's going to be very, very heavy on the biological children, biological parent side, which goes back to what I was talking about earlier. I forgot the language I used. I can't remember. I can't find it in my notes either. Of maybe, that inside or outside of language, the biological parent and biological children having a little bit more pull, having a little more loyalty there. But it's not something that step families, blended families can't overcome. In his book, Step Families, which I have here, this is by Dr. James Bray and John Kelly. They discuss how in the first 2 years, 2 whole years of biological or of blended families, when they first form, the first 2 years are going to be the hardest. And within those first 2 years, they say that 1/4 of blended families don't quite make it. There's very intense problems. There are relationship struggles, power dynamic struggles, all kinds of things going on. So those first 2 years are very, very difficult. So imagine having your meal in your crock pot for 2 years before your meat really gets cooked through and can provide the nutrients that you need. That's kind of how we can think of blended families. So now moving on to the second part of this, this conversation, and it's not nearly going to take as long as the first part, don't worry. So in ministering to blended families, like Rick said at the very beginning, I found very few resources on being able to minister specifically to blended families, which makes this webinar, I think, even more important as we move forward in our ministry lives and in helping people with their own lives. So I just want to remind you that if you work or volunteer in a church, you are going to be exposed to blended families. And most likely, if you're watching this, you have had some experience with blended families before. Did you as much as it did. But first I want to, before we get into the specifics of how to minister, I want to look at some examples of biblical blended families. So all my examples are from the Old Testament. I'm just an Old Testament junkie. I just love it. So Joseph, Technicolor Dreamcoat, hopefully you can see him. I don't know if I can move this. I can. Okay. So Joseph and his colorful coat, he came from a very big blended family. So Joseph's father, who was Jacob, had many wives and had lots and lots of half siblings. They eventually, if you know the story, they eventually abused him, sold him into slavery, and he ended up rising in power. Excuse me. But Joseph was, I think, hopefully I'm saying this right, I'm pretty sure that he was Jacob's 11th child, the first one that he had with Rachel. And he had lots and lots of half-siblings. So something that happened even long ago in the Bible. A few more. Moses himself came from a blended family. Very famous story. The Pharaoh had asked for all the baby boys to be killed. Moses is put in a basket in the river by his mother, and eventually Pharaoh's daughter finds him. She takes him in and she raises him as her own. So Moses grows up in royalty in a family that he was not biologically related to at all, and eventually comes to connect again with his biological family, but still has the ties to his blended family. And that's found in Exodus 2 if you're interested. And finally, our dear Jesus, he came from a blended family technically. His father, Joseph, wasn't really his biological father. And if you think of the definition of a blended family, that's usually having at least one non-biological parent. So when you think about blended families, I didn't even think about this until someone else had pointed it out when I was doing my research. But when we think about blended families and how important they can be in our ministry, think back to Jesus. Jesus himself was in a blended family, and I think that is a very important thing for us to remember. So let me move my screen again. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about more specifics of blended families. Usually blended families are the result of some sort of divorce or breaking apart. And a divorce ministry, if you don't have one already, I think is very important. So divorce ministry, it doesn't condone divorce if that is something that maybe you're worried about, but thinking about Celebrate Recovery, that doesn't condone substance use, but it helps people get on the right track where they need to be. It helps people have the right resources to be able to carry everything out that they need to in their lives. Same thing goes for a divorce ministry. People who go through divorce are very hurt, they're very broken. A lot of times they don't understand why it's happening or how they even got to this place in their life. So really it is a deep place of grief and trying to work through issues that are very well done in a group setting. If you think of it like children's Sunday school classes, you wouldn't really put like a fifth grader in a kindergarten or preschool Sunday school class because developmentally they're going to be very different. Same thing for maybe a married couples class and a divorce singles class. They're going to be going through very different times of their life at that time. And divorce ministry, just it opens up a space for healing and restoration. So maybe something like divorce care. That's the same people who do grief share, if you've ever heard of that. Maybe divorced or single Sunday school classes, singles events. There's lots of ways to kind of incorporate this divorce ministry. When you're choosing to minister specifically with blended families, I just want to point out, I want you to be aware of who and how you include people. So a lot of research was done on stepmothers, because stepmothers usually sign up for a role that can be very difficult for them. They get to help with the homework, they get to do the cooking, they get to do all that stuff, but they don't quite always get the love and affection that the biological mom gets. So I just bring up the stepmothers specifically because traditionally they are in a more caregiving role, single family, but just kind of as a more broad idea. So they may be very insecure about this role, especially in those first 2 years of being in that role. They can unintentionally be excluded in many of the mom celebrations, so like Mother's Days or Women's Ministry. And the same goes for stepfathers. Sometimes the step parents are kind of forgotten about, especially when it comes to celebrating what we think of traditional families as. So try to be inclusive of step parents, especially at Mother's Day and Father's Day, if that's something your church celebrates. Just really being conscious of the role that they play and that they also put in effort and work into their families. And a lot of times, you know, if that crock pot is cooking real good, they're going to be proud of their family, even if it's not a family that they are related to biologically. Continuing on, this is more the child side of being aware of who and how you include people. So children usually are not in charge of their custody schedules, if there is a custody schedule. And sometimes it makes it hard for them to attend. This is just a hard fact to come to terms with sometimes, but it's not always the child's fault. Most likely it's never the child's fault. And it's not really the parent's fault either, because the more that a child can see both biological parents, if it's healthy, the better that child is probably going to be doing in life. So just make sure that you make children of blended families, just make them feel comfortable, make them feel welcomed when they're there, celebrate when they're there, don't harass them about not being there when they can't be there, you know, treat them like normal kids. If only one biological parent is in the church, maybe ask the child about, oh, hey, how's your mom doing? I haven't heard you talk about her in a while. You know, is she still doing that job? Is she coming to your soccer games? You know, make them feel like you do care about the other side of their family, because if their family cares about them, you care about their family because you care about them too. And just remember to be a listening ear for your students and your children and your youth in your church. If they want to express frustrations, let them. You know, help them remember that they're on the same team as both families that they might be a part of, or as a part of the many families that they're a part of. Help them remember that crock pot can take a while to get warmed up, but once it's gotten there, it can be a beautiful experience. So helping them remember that their step family, their step parents, their step siblings, they're all on the same team. And my go-to is, if you don't know how to include someone or who to include with a step family or a blended family, just ask them. Just be straightforward and honest, and of course use sensitive language. So maybe, hey, I noticed that your family isn't a traditional family, so how do you want me to include you in our ministries? What do you want to be a part of? Helping them feel normalized and validated as step parents and step siblings and step families, that can go a long way in helping people feel welcomed in churches. And finally, something to remember, that as the body of Christ, we all make up a blended family. no matter what church you go to, you're going to be ministering to and ministering with people that you're not related to. And I think that is a beautiful thing. And I think that Christ designed that intentionally for us to know that our ties go beyond blood, and our ties go beyond just who we like and who we're like. Our ties go to as far as, our ties go as far as God's love will allow them to. And I think that is a really great thing to remember, that Jesus himself came from a blended family, and he designed his church family as a blended family as well. So I hope that you got something out of this this time that we had together. And I would like to open up time for any questions that anybody had or any comments.
Thank you, Chrissy. And again, for our participants who have joined us on our webinar live on our website, we have a Q&A box that you can type in a question if you'd like to. And Chrissy, I really, one thing, while we're waiting for your questions, if you have them, the blended family, just some of the questions that you propose asking, I think are very helpful. For those who have not been raised in a blended family, the question of what is it like to be raised in a blended family, or what is life like for you? How do you, or from the minister to the parent side, how do you want us to include you to help them with that? I thought those were some very helpful questions.
Yeah, as a therapist, I ask lots and lots of questions all day. So
Yeah.
I find that it's very helpful in ministry as well to, if you don't know, just ask. And usually people are very open to even just being asked something, and knowing that you took the time to care about them in that way.
Well, and I think if they know that it's coming from a caring, supportive angle, not a just curious or whatever, it's
Yeah.
like then that is very helpful for the family.
Yes, definitely.
It seems that one of the maybe positive changes, in a sense, that has happened. I know that maybe the divorce rate has been pretty stable at the rate it is now. But one thing that has happened in society, and maybe even in churches, is that there's not the stigma that there used to be, and so that's maybe a kind of a positive thing, that maybe society has
Yes.
helped the church to be more Christ-like,
Yeah.
to not judge, and to be willing to empathize.
Yes. And just remembering at the end of the day, my pastor, he says this all the time, but he says, nobody gets married with the intention of getting divorced. Maybe super rich people or something, I don't know. But most general people, they're not getting married with the intention of getting divorced one day. You go into it, and then life happens sometimes. Things that we can't always control, or things that aren't always our fault. Some things just happen. And bad things happen all the time, but the more supportive we can be of each other, I think the more Christ-like we are being in this world.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing with us. We don't have other questions, so we won't carry this any further, except that I know that you do have another slide of resources.
Oh, yes.
We could just scroll to that.
Yeah.
So here, and then also on our website, we will put this as a Word document to accompany the webinar, so that you all who are watching you can jot this down if you want, but you could also go to our website and just find that as a Word document. But again, some good resources that Chrissy has found for us that can help us to deal with this population. And Chrissy, thank you so much for what you've done to help us, to enlighten us about some of the needs and the ways we can minister to people.
Yes. Well, thank you for having me. It was a joy and an honor to be able to share this information.
Thank you.